Hey y'all, this video will introduce our two texts for the week. The Confessions of Nat Turner, which was written by Thomas Ruffin Gray in 1831, and the comic Nat Turner, written by Kyle Baker in 2005. So to start, Nat Turner is a figure from American history that, to my mind, is very underappreciated and understudied. We know next to nothing about him except that he was probably born around 1800, and we know that he died in 1831. According to a scholar named Christopher Tomlin, he says, Nat Turner is known to history as a 30-year-old Virginia slave who led a bloody rebellion that resulted in the death of 55 whites, mostly women and children. Beyond that, he is famous for being well-nigh unknowable. He has no gravesite, no remains. There is no likeness of him. To the historian Kenneth Greenberg, Nat Turner is the most famous, least-known person in American history. So the bust to the right is a reproduction of what we think he may have looked like, but we simply do not know. I want to note quickly that there is some politics to what we call the rebellion or the rising or the revolt, depending on what we want to call it, that happened in 1831. I prefer the term rising because it's relatively neutral. But that is what Nat Turner is most famous for, and the two texts that we're reading for today have two very different takes on how to situate that rising within U.S. history and what we might do with that history today. So for some background, the 1831 rising occurred in Southampton, Virginia, which you can see here on this map. This is in the southernmost portion of Virginia, which, as you can see from Kentucky over here, is not all that different from where Kentucky is. The line between Maryland and Pennsylvania is known as the Mason-Dixon line. It will curve past West Virginia and Kentucky on over, and generally the states to the north were non-slaveholding states. The states to the south were slaveholding states. But as we know from our studies in history, many of these states were battleground states, quite literally during the Civil War, which occurred from 1861 to 1865, right, when you can see many famous battleground sites throughout Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, throughout the South. And although we think of the Civil War perhaps as the apex of the conflict between slaveholding states and non-slaveholding states, we might also think about the deeper history there, that the enslaved persons, enslaved communities in these areas led smaller risings, revolts of their own, and Nat Turner's is one of them. There's also a book called Wake that is a comic as well that's full of female-led slave rising. So if you're interested in that topic, I would suggest checking out that book as well. Now, Nat Turner's rising occurred in August of 1831, and he was appointed a lawyer named Thomas Ruffin Gray, a white man originally from Southampton, Virginia, but who had practiced in Baltimore for some time, Baltimore, Maryland. And what we know is that when Thomas Gray represented Nat Turner, he was also given permission to interview Nat and to take down what he calls, what Gray called at least, Nat's confessions, and then publish them in November of 1831, so really quickly after the rising. And as scholar Tomlin suggests, that circumstances suggest that much of the pamphlet's account of the rebellion existed in draft prior to Gray's conversation with Turner, i.e. that Thomas Ruffin Gray had already drafted what he wanted Nat Turner to have said before he approached that particular conversation. Now, the original Confessions of Nat Turner was printed in 50,000 copies, and it sold for 29 cents, or about $9 in our current money. What that means is that when we read the Confessions of Nat Turner, we should read it with a kind of critical, skeptical eye for the kind of angle of vision, the politics, the things that Gray values, that he thinks his audience will value, that colors his representation of Nat's life and of Nat's rising. Now, the story of Nat Turner has generated many, many versions of the text, partly because it is such an important moment in American history, and partly because it's understudied. As the preface to Nat Turner, the comic Kyle Baker's version, suggests that for a long, long time, if you were studying American history in school, you might get a paragraph on Nat Turner, but you might not get anything at all. So the combination of the importance of this moment and the unknown quality of Nat's life, the possible misrepresentations of that life through Thomas Gray's account, gave fertile ground for people to create their own versions. And one in 1967 was William Styron's Confessions of Nat Turner, which won the Pulitzer Prize. However, that was very quickly responded to and critiqued by African American writers who published a kind of response to that noted that it was sort of a sensationalist account that misrepresented many aspects of the lives of enslaved persons before the end of the Civil War. More recently, you may remember the 2016 film Birth of a Nation by Nate Parker. It's a celebrated film adaptation that's meant to rewrite the 1915 film The Birth of a Nation, which focused on the KKK. And this film has a critically acclaimed soundtrack as well. So if you're interested in the story, you might check out this film as well. However, what's interesting to us today is that we're reading Kyle Baker's 2005 version of Nat Turner, which retells Nat's life in the form of a graphic novel. Now, this won the Eisner Award for Best Reality-Based Work, and an Eisner is sort of like an Oscar for comics, except whereas an Oscar, you might win it as an actor or actress or whatever. Here, Kyle Baker did the whole thing. He was the author, the penciler, the inker. He did all of it. The whole comic is just his. Now, it's nearly wordless, which we might think about in terms of giving voice to the past, right? How Kyle Baker is attempting to give us an image-based witness of the events that kind of gets around the problem of language, gets around the problems of Thomas Gray's representation of Nat Turner's life. So the story of Nat Turner is highly mediated. And what I mean by that is that whatever happened in the past, that's sort of the first level of mediation. We don't know what actually happened because all we have is secondhand accounts. Even Nat's confessions was taken down by Thomas Gray, who had his own agenda, right? So there's whatever happened in the past, and then the second level of mediation is what Nat Turner told to Thomas Gray, and or what Gray happened to have written down, right? That's also influenced by other adaptations of the event that happened around that time or after, right? Right when the Rising happened, contemporary newspapers took up that story, put their own spin on it, put their own interpretations on it, and then much later in time, we have William Styron's novel, we have Kyle Baker's version, we have the Birth of a Nation film. We've got a lot of things that are between us and what actually happened. And I think part of what makes that so interesting is that we just don't know that much about Nat's life. It is an unfortunate reality that the lives of many enslaved persons are lost to history simply because the dominant powers denied them the ability of literacy, denied them the ability to keep track of their own family history. So what I think is so important about Kyle Baker's version is it's attempting to recuperate part of that past, to give voice to it, to witness it, and to make us think about that as an important part of our nation's history. So the comic, some important features of that comic, it's black and white throughout. There's some sepia tones. There's very minimal text. Most of that text is ambient. Sometimes it'll be in the form of a noise. Sometimes it'll be Nat as a young man yelling "run" to his father. But most of the text is taken from historical accounts. We also see throughout that as you're reading, you'll notice that sometimes artistic style shifts. And that's generally when Kyle Baker's doing one of two things. First is he's either importing directly woodcuts from the period, which we see on the right, that is from the 1830s. And the second is that he is gesturing towards the surviving artifacts from that era. So you'll see when he depicts houses, for example, those are typically houses that are still standing that you can visit. And then whereas the shaggier lines, the charcoal lines, are stuff that is necessarily generated by the imagination, by Kyle Baker's imagination, simply because we don't know those details of Nat Turner's life. So if you haven't read comics before, you read them like you would a regular novel. You start at the top left, you work your way right, then down, then over, right? So if this is a page, we would start here reading this, move to this, and down to this, and down to this. These are called frames. These are called panels, and they're separated by what are called gutters. Now, in this particular page, we see young Nat looking through a doorway into a schoolhouse scene where the young children are learning their ABCs. The door is literally slammed in his face. Then we see his face looks a little angry, perturbed. That's up to your interpretation. And then he sort of gets a little defiant, but still scared, putting his ear up to the door. He wants access to literacy. He wants to be able to understand what the other kids are understanding. He wants to have the literacy that's been denied to him by those systems of power. So these illustrations are rich. You know, you can read the book really quickly, but I'd encourage you to linger over the pages, to take some time understanding how we get from one panel to the next. And I do think the lack of language forces us
to focus on that image, on the images on the page, and we can close read those images in a similar way that we could a standard written text. We can look at facial features, we can look at color, shading, all of those things that can be part of our analyses. We've talked about Art Spiegelman's Mouse a little bit before, but this is a really important text for Nat Turner as well, an important intertext, because Mouse focuses on one generation trying to record the trauma of the Holocaust of the previous generation and make that available to a wider audience. So throughout the text, there are so many references to the eyes. There's meta references to Art, who's the younger Mouse here, taking down the story of his father, Vladek's the older one here, and here we can see the number that is branded on him in the Holocaust. And as Art is trying to write the story about his father, part of that is bearing witness. And he chooses the comic book form, which is a sort of radical departure for Holocaust literature, I think, so that readers have to literally see and witness what happened. It forces us to confront the horror of that past in a different way. And I do think that's something that Nat Turner is interested as well, and that Mouse is an important intertext for this text as well. So if you have not read Mouse before, I'd suggest that you do. And if you want to read it and write about it for a final paper in terms of either Everything is Illuminated or Nat Turner, I'd be happy for that to happen, right? And I think that Baker is intentionally alluding to Mouse through certain stylistic choices, such as the black and white illustration, such as its focus on witnessing, and it's trying to reproduce the events from Turner's perspective rather than Gray's perspective, right? Trying to get away from the problem of Gray's editorializing, and as such, I think it becomes a reclamation project. That reclamation project, I believe, is gestured towards on the cover of the text. On the cover of the text, we have a hand holding a sword with the moon behind it. Now, that hand, as we know, we've come to recognize, is an important part of such movements as Black Lives Matter, right? So we see hands throughout the text. So, for example, in one of the middle pages of the text, we see this hand here holding a gun as Nat goes by. Or earlier in the text, one of the brutal scenes of the text is when enslaved person has his hands cut off as he's for playing a drum. And one of the things I think that Kyle Baker's doing is suggesting that Nat Turner should be seen within the long history of the civil rights struggle, right? That Nat Turner is the only one pictured in this image, for example. The other people are just hands. They could belong to anyone. And I think that's sort of gesturing towards that these people are also sort of unknown actors within this history of civil rights. And part of what they're trying to do is reclaim power and agency that has been taken away from them by certain systems and of white supremacy. So I hope this short video has introduced you to some big issues within Nat Turner. It's a rewarding text. You can read it quickly because it doesn't have words, but I would encourage you to read it slowly. I'd encourage you to reread it and to really think about it in terms of the 1831 Thomas Gray version. All right, thanks, y'all, and let me know if you have any questions, and have a great day.